on, Sam! I am coming for you!
Help me! I am scared in here!
I have got you now, my boy.
Charles Harrington was a cold billionaire who thought he had seen everything in life. But nothing prepared him for the sound of a child fighting for his life inside his own home. Little Sam, the maid's young son, was trapped in a dark, forbidden room, weeping in pure agony. No one knew who held the key, and no one dared to ask. Finally, Charles could not take the cries anymore. He marched down the dark hallway, broke the lock, and stepped inside. The sickening sight in that dark corner changed the old billionaire forever, forcing him to make a choice that shocked the high society. Charles Harrington was a man who had everything, yet he possessed absolutely nothing. At 62 years old, he was one of the wealthiest real estate moguls in the country. He owned skyscrapers, private jets, and a sprawling historical estate on the edge of the city. The mansion was surrounded by high stone walls and iron gates. Inside, the floors were made of polished marble. The walls were adorned with paintings that cost millions of dollars. But the mansion was entirely empty of warmth. Charles lived there alone. His wife had passed away 10 years ago. His only son, Stephen, was a bitter disappointment. Stephen was 35 years old, arrogant, lazy, and cruel. He did not care about the family business. He only cared about spending his father's money and throwing lavish parties. Charles knew his son was spoiled, but he was too tired to fight him anymore. Charles's health was failing, and his heart was weak. Because of his loneliness, Charles became a cold man. He rarely spoke to his staff. He walked through his massive home like a ghost. He demanded absolute perfection, absolute silence, and absolute obedience. The servants feared him. They walked on eggshells whenever Charles was in the room. Then Cassandra Dupont arrived. Cassandra was a 24-year-old woman who had fallen on incredibly hard times. She was hired as the assistant head housekeeper. Cassandra was a gentle soul with kind, tired eyes. She worked harder than anyone else in the house. She polished the silver until it shone like diamonds. She scrubbed the floors until they were spotless. But Cassandra did not come to the mansion alone. She had a 4-year-old son named Sam. When Cassandra was hired, the head housekeeper gave her one very strict rule. The master of the house hates noise. The old housekeeper warned. If your child causes any trouble, if he breaks anything, or if he even makes a loud sound, you will both be thrown out on the street. Do you understand? Cassandra nodded quickly, tears welling in her eyes. She had no other place to go. Sam's father had abandoned them before the boy was born. They had been living out of a battered old car for weeks. This job was their absolute last saving grace. I understand, Cassandra whispered. Sam will be good. I promise. He is a very quiet boy. And he was. For the first few weeks, Sam was like a little shadow. Cassandra kept him in the small servants' quarters at the back of the mansion during her shifts. Sam would sit on a small rug for hours. He had one single toy, a worn-out, brown teddy bear with a missing button eye. He never cried. He never whined. He never ran down the long hallways. Sometimes, Charles would catch a glimpse of the boy. Charles would be walking down the corridor, and he would see a tiny face peeking out from a doorway. Sam would look up at the tall, intimidating billionaire with wide, innocent eyes. Charles never spoke to the child. He would simply frown, tighten his grip on his cane, and walk past. He told himself he did not care about the boy. He told himself he did not care about anyone. But Charles noticed things. He noticed that Sam was far too thin. He noticed that the boy's clothes were clean but terribly frayed. And most of all, he noticed the boy's absolute silence. It was not natural for a 4-year-old child to be that quiet. It was the silence of a creature that was trying very hard to remain invisible. The peace did not last. It began on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Charles was sitting in his grand study, reviewing financial documents. The house was quiet, save for the sound of rain tapping against the heavy glass windows. Suddenly, a sound pierced through the silence of the mansion. It was a scream. It was a sharp, high-pitched cry of absolute terror. Charles froze. He dropped his pen. The sound echoed through the halls, muffled but clear. It was the unmistakable voice of a child. Charles stood up, his old joints popping. He walked out of his study and looked down the long corridor. The screaming continued. It sounded desperate, full of panic. The head housekeeper came running down the hall, her face pale. "What is that noise?" Charles demanded, his voice booming like thunder. "I thought I gave strict orders about silence in this house." "I am so sorry, Mr. Harrington," the housekeeper stammered, trembling. "It is Cassandra's boy. It is little Sam. I don't know what is wrong with him. He has been doing this for the past 3 days." "Where is he?" Charles asked, his eyes narrowing. He is down in the old East Wing storage corridor," she replied, looking down at the floor. "Cassandra locks him in one of the spare utility rooms during her afternoon shift, so he doesn't wander into your living space. But lately, he just starts screaming out of nowhere." Charles's brow furrowed. "And where is Cassandra now?" "She's upstairs, cleaning the master guest rooms, sir. Should I go get her? Should I tell her to pack her bags?" Charles looked down the dark hallway leading to the East Wing. The screams were fading now, turning into soft, heartbreaking whimpers. Something about those whimpers touched a long-buried nerve in Charles's chest. It reminded him of a time long ago, a time he spent his whole life trying to forget. "No," Charles said coldly. "Do not fire her yet, but tell her to quiet that child down. If I hear it again, there will be consequences." The next day, the screaming happened again, and the day after that. Every single afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, Sam would begin to cry. It was always the same. A sudden burst of absolute terror, followed by frantic banging on a heavy door. And then, after 20 minutes, total silence. The staff began to gossip. "Why does she lock him up like that?" One cook whispered in the kitchen. "Maybe she is neglecting him," a gardener replied. "She seems like a good mother, but you never know. People do strange things when they are desperate." "The poor boy sounds like he is being tortured in there," another maid added. "But nobody wants to get involved. If Mr. Harrington finds out how bad it really is, we will all lose our jobs." Charles heard the gossip. He heard his servants whispering in the corners. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was not his business. He was a billionaire, a businessman. He had a corporation to run. He did not have time for the domestic dramas of his hired help. But the cries haunted him. At night, when he closed his eyes, he couldn't sleep. The sound of that little boy's terror rang in his ears. It didn't sound like a child who was just throwing a tantrum because he was locked in a room. It sounded like a child who was facing a monster. Charles decided to observe Cassandra more closely. He watched her during her shifts. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her hands shook when she poured his coffee. But when she looked at Sam, her eyes were filled with nothing but pure, unadulterated love. One morning, Charles saw Cassandra giving Sam her own breakfast. She sat the boy on her lap in the kitchen pantry, feeding him small pieces of toast, while she smiled and sang a soft lullaby to him. The boy smiled back, hugging his one-eyed teddy bear. Charles saw this and realized something. Cassandra loved her son more than life itself. She was not a cruel mother. She was not a monster. So why was the boy screaming every afternoon in that locked room? Before we reveal the shocking truth of what was behind that door and who was causing those terrifying screams, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss another emotional story. And right now, leave a comment below telling us exactly where in the world you are watching this video from. We love reading your comments. Now, let's continue with our story. While Charles was wrestling with this mystery, his son Stephen arrived at the mansion. Stephen had been gone for 3 weeks on a vacation in Europe, spending thousands of Charles's hard-earned dollars. Stephen walked into the mansion like he owned the place. He threw his expensive leather jacket onto a priceless antique chair. He immediately ordered the staff to bring him a drink. "Father," Stephen said, walking into Charles's study without knocking, "I need more funds transferred to my account. Europe was expensive, and I have some debts to settle." Charles looked up from his desk. His eyes were cold and filled with deep disappointment. "You just spent $50,000 last month, Stephen. You do nothing for this family. You do nothing for the company. All you do is bleed me dry." Stephen laughed arrogantly. He poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey from Charles's private cart. "Oh, come on, old man. What else are you going to do with all this money? You can't take it with you to the grave. And besides, I am your only heir. It's all going to be mine anyway." Charles's grip tightened on his cane. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, a reminder of his weak heart. He hated what his son had become. Stephen was vicious, selfish, and lacked even an ounce of human empathy. "Get out of my sight," Charles growled. Stephen smirked, taking a sip of his drink. "Fine, I'm going to go rest. This place is boring anyway." As Stephen walked out of the study, he ran directly into Cassandra, who was carrying a tray of fresh linens. The tray slipped from her hands. The linens tumbled onto the floor. "Watch where you are going, you clumsy idiot," Stephen shouted, his face turning red with sudden anger. "I am so sorry, sir. I am so sorry," Cassandra cried, instantly dropping to her knees to gather the linens. She was trembling with fear. Stephen looked down at her with pure disgust. He raised his expensive Italian leather shoe and intentionally stepped on Cassandra's hand, crushing her fingers against the hard marble floor. Cassandra gasped in pain, but she stifled her cry. She kept her head down. "Learn your place," Stephen sneered, before walking away down the hall. Charles saw the entire exchange from his study door. A deep, burning fury ignited inside his chest. He looked at Cassandra, who was quietly weeping as she cradled her bruised hand. Charles wanted to step forward, to say something, but his old, rigid pride held him back. He retreated into his study, but the seed of doubt about his own family had grown into a massive tree. The next day was Friday. The clock on the wall of Charles's study ticked slowly. It was 2:45 p.m. For some reason, Charles could not focus on his work. He kept looking at the clock. 2:50 p.m., 2:55 p.m., and then, exactly at 3 p.m., it started. The screams broke through the silence of the mansion. But today, the sound was different. It wasn't just a regular cry. It was a blood-curdling shriek of pure, unbridled horror. It sounded as if the little boy was fighting for his very life. Charles stood up so fast his chair flipped over backward. He didn't care. He grabbed his cane and walked out of the room. His heart was pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He walked down the main corridor. He turned into the old east wing. This part of the mansion was rarely used. It was dark, dusty, and cold. The screams grew louder and louder with every step he took. "No, please. No. Mommy, help me." The little boy's voice echoed against the bare walls. Charles followed the sound until he reached a heavy, dark oak door at the very end of the hall. This was an old utility and storage room. It was supposed to be empty. Charles reached for the doorknob. He turned it. It was locked from the outside. The key was missing from the lock. Inside, the boy was hysterical. He was slamming his tiny hands against the thick wood of the door. "Sam," Charles called out, his voice cracking. "Sam, can you hear me?" The boy didn't answer. He just kept screaming, his voice turning hoarse and desperate. Charles turned around and saw the head housekeeper running toward him, her face white as a sheet. "Where's the key?" Charles roared. "Where's the key to this room?" I don't know, sir," she cried. "Cassandra usually has it. But Cassandra is currently out at the grocery store running errands for the chef. She left 20 minutes ago." "If Cassandra has the key, then who locked this door?" Charles demanded. Suddenly, the boy inside let out another terrifying shriek, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. Charles did not hesitate. He might have been an old man with a weak heart, but at that moment, an overwhelming surge of adrenaline took over his body. He raised his heavy walking cane, which was made of solid, reinforced steel, and began slamming it against the old brass lock of the door. Bang! 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 The wood around the lock began to splinter. Charles struck the door with all the strength left in his aging body. With one final, massive blow, the lock gave way. The heavy oak door swung wide open. Charles stepped into the dark room. The heavy curtains were drawn shut, blocking out all sunlight. The room smelled of old dust and stale air. He looked around frantically. In the far corner of the room, little Sam was curled into a tight ball. He was shaking violently, His tiny hands were covering his ears. His face was soaked with tears, and his clothes were covered in dust. But Sam was not alone in the room. Standing in the center of the dark room was a tall figure. The figure was wearing a horrifying, grotesque rubber monster mask. It had jagged teeth, bulging red eyes, and fake blood dripping down the chin. The figure was holding a large, bright flashlight, shining it directly into the little boy's terrified eyes. When the door burst open, the masked figure froze. Charles's breath hitched in his throat. He felt a wave of pure fury wash over him. "Who are you?" Charles shouted, raising his cane. "Get away from that child." The masked figure didn't speak. Instead, they panicked. The person tried to push past Charles to escape into the hallway, but Charles was faster. He lunged forward and grabbed the person by the collar of their expensive silk shirt. Charles used his cane to hook the person's leg, tripping them. The figure crashed heavily onto the hard floor. The flashlight rolled away, illuminating the room. Charles stood over the fallen figure. Without a single word, he reached down and violently ripped the horrifying rubber mask off the person's face. Charles gasped. His heart completely stopped for a fraction of a second. It was Stephen, his own son. Stephen was lying on the floor, panting, a cruel and pathetic smirk slowly forming on his face. "Stephen," Charles whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and profound disgust. What are you doing?" Stephen stood up slowly, dusting off his expensive trousers. He showed absolutely no remorse. He looked at his father with a cold, mocking grin. "Oh, come on, Dad," Stephen said smoothly, as if he had just been caught playing a harmless prank. "Don't look at me like that. I was just having a little bit of fun. This place is incredibly boring, and that little brat was getting on my nerves with his existence." Charles could barely speak. "Fun? You have been coming into this room every single day, locking a 4-year-old child inside and terrifying him with a mask? Why?" Stephen shrugged his shoulders carelessly. "Because I can. Because his mother needs to learn a lesson. She didn't show me proper respect when she started working here. And besides, look at him. He's just a maid's son. He's nothing. He is garbage. His cries are amusing. It passes the time." Charles looked from his son to the corner of the room. Little Sam was still shaking, weeping silently now, hugging his teddy bear so tightly his tiny knuckles were white. At that exact moment, something snapped inside Charles Harrington. The cold, unfeeling billionaire, who had spent years ignoring the world around him, suddenly woke up. He realized that the true monster in his house was not a creature from a nightmare. It was the son he had raised, the son he had spoiled, the son he had allowed to become a predator. Charles's face turned from pale shock to a deep, burning crimson. He stepped closer to Stephen. The air in the room became heavy and dangerous. "You are a monster," Charles said, his voice deadly quiet. It was far more terrifying than a shout. Stephen's smirk finally faded. He saw the look in his father's eyes and took a step back. "Hey, calm down, old man. Your heart can't take this kind of stress. Don't get worked up over a servant's kid." "Silence," Charles roared, the sound echoing through the entire mansion. He raised his cane and pointed it directly at Stephen's chest. Get out of this room, get out of this house, and get out of my life." Stephen laughed nervously. "What do you mean, get out? This is my home too. You need me. I am your only son. I am the heir to the Harrington fortune." "Not anymore," Charles said, his voice as cold as ice. "Today you are nothing. I am cutting you off completely. I am removing you from my will. Every single cent, every single building, every single share of my company will be stripped away from you. You will leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back." Stephen's face turned completely white. He realized his father was not joking. "You can't do that. You can't leave your empire to nobody." "I would rather burn my empire to the ground than leave a single penny to a sadistic coward like you," Charles growled. "Now, get out before I call the police and have you arrested for child abuse and harassment. I have the staff as witnesses. I have my own eyes as proof. Move." Stephen opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer force of Charles's anger terrified him. He turned around and ran out of the room, sprinting down the hallway like a frightened animal. Charles watched him go. He knew he would never see his son again, and for the first time in 10 years, Charles felt a sense of immense relief. Charles turned his attention back to the corner of the room. The danger was gone, but the little boy was still terrified. Charles dropped his cane to the floor. It made a loud clattering sound, but Charles didn't care. The billionaire, a man who had not knelt for anyone in decades, slowly dropped to both of his knees on the dusty floor. He crawled over to the little boy. "Sam," Charles said, his voice incredibly soft, filled with a tenderness he hadn't used since his own wife was alive. "It's okay, little guy. The monster is gone. He will never, ever come back. I promise you." Sam slowly lowered his hands from his ears. He looked at Charles with big, tearful eyes. He saw the old man's face. There was no anger there. There was only sadness and deep kindness. Slowly, tentatively, Sam reached out. He didn't grab his teddy bear. Instead, he reached out and touched Charles's wrinkled cheek with his tiny hand. Charles felt a tear escape his own eye. It rolled down his face, wetting the boy's fingers. Charles reached forward and gently scooped the little boy into his arms. He held him close to his chest. Sam buried his face in Charles's expensive suit jacket, his little body finally stopping its violent shaking. A few minutes later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. Cassandra came running into the room. Her grocery bags dropped outside. She had heard the commotion from the staff. "Sam!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside them. She looked at Charles, who was holding her son, and then she saw the discarded monster mask on the floor. In an instant, she understood everything. She realized what had been happening to her precious boy while she was away. She began to sob uncontrollably, covering her face with her hands. "I am so sorry, Mr. Harrington," she wept. "I didn't know. I thought he was just scared of the dark. I didn't know someone was hurting him. Please don't fire us, please." Charles looked up at Cassandra. He stood up, still holding the little boy securely in his arms. "Cassandra, look at me," Charles said firmly. Cassandra raised her tear-stained face. "You are not fired," Charles said, a gentle smile appearing on his face for the first time in years. "And you will never have to clean another floor in this house again." Cassandra gasped. "Sir, from this day forward, you are not my maid," Charles explained. "You and Sam are my family. This mansion is too big for an old man like me. I need life in this house. I need laughter. I want you to live here as my guests, as my family. I will take care of Sam's education. I will take care of your future. You will never have to worry about being poor or abandoned ever again." Cassandra looked at him in absolute disbelief. Fresh tears ran down her cheeks, but this time, they were tears of pure joy and gratitude. She threw her arms around Charles and her son, sobbing out her thanks. 1 year later, the Harrington mansion was unrecognizable. It was no longer a cold, dark museum of expensive things. The heavy, dark curtains had been pulled back, allowing the bright, warm sunshine to flood every single room. The polished marble floors were no longer perfectly silent. Instead, the halls echoed with a new sound, the sound of a child's laughter. Little Sam was now 5 years old. He was healthy, chubby-cheeked, and full of life. He no longer hid in corners. He no longer clutched his teddy bear in fear. On this particular afternoon, exactly at 3 o'clock, Charles Harrington was sitting in his study. The clock ticked on the wall, but Charles wasn't looking at financial documents. He was holding a large children's storybook. The door to the study burst open. Sam came running in, wearing a bright red cap and a massive smile on his face. He jumped right onto Charles's lap, completely unafraid of the powerful billionaire. "Grandpa Charles! Grandpa Charles!" Sam cheered. "It's 3 o'clock. It's time for our story." Charles smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling with pure happiness. He wrapped his strong arms around the boy and opened the book. "Yes, it is Sam," Charles whispered, kissing the top of the boy's head. "Let's read your favorite one." From the doorway, Cassandra stood watching them, a beautiful smile on her face. She was now managing a major charitable foundation that Charles had started in her name, helping single mothers and vulnerable children across the city. Charles looked up and met Cassandra's eyes. They shared a silent look of profound understanding. Nobody knew why the maid's toddler cried in that locked room. It was a dark mystery born of cruelty and malice. But sometimes, it takes the deepest darkness to force a good man to finally open the door and let the light back into his life. Charles had saved Sam from a monster, but in reality, Sam had saved Charles from a lifetime of cold, miserable loneliness. And for that, the billionaire would be eternally grateful.